The city was a jungle of metal and neon. It buzzed with life and lights, but beneath the surface, the darkness ran deeper than anyone knew. Jiang Zhen stood at the edge of a rooftop, the cool wind tugging at his hair as he peered into the night. He wasn't here to admire the view, nor was he here to feel the pulse of the city's hidden veins. He was a hunter, and his prey was on the move. A rogue soldier, once part of a bio-enhancement program designed to turn ordinary humans into superhuman machines, had escaped the grasp of the government. His name was Li Xiu, a name Jiang hadn't heard in years, but one he would never forget. Xiu had been part of Jiang's training unit, back when the program was still in its early days. They had fought side by side, surviving together, pushing their bodies and minds past the limits of human endurance. That was before Xiu turned on them. Before he ran, the hunt began at dusk. The government had tracked Xiu's movements to this district, a crumbling part of the city far from the bright, shiny towers of corporate elites. It was a place forgotten by most, where people lived on the edges of society. For Jiang, it was a familiar battlefield. He had hunted in worse places. His mission was simple: find Xiu, capture or kill him, and bring him back. He didn't need to ask why. Soldiers didn't ask why. He had been a weapon for so long that it no longer mattered if the mission was just or not. The thrill of the hunt was enough. Jiang had learned over the years that bio-enhancements could be both a blessing and a curse. His own body had been altered. He wasn't the man he once was, and yet, the person he had become was more than human. Stronger. Faster. More efficient. But the side effects were beginning to show. The occasional burst of emotion. The odd dizziness. He chalked it up to fatigue. After all, hunting rogue soldiers wasn't exactly a leisurely job, but tonight, Jiang felt something else, something darker creeping into his bones. He ignored it. Focused on the mission. He dropped into an alleyway, the clatter of his boots on the concrete loud in the silence. His mind was sharp, his senses alert, but something felt wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, like they were reaching for him. He pushed forward, ignoring the unsettling feeling. Xiu had been here recently. He could feel it, the scent of sweat, the metallic tang of blood, the sharp edge of fear. It was all around him. Xiu had been here, but now he was gone. But then Jiang felt it, a shift in the air. It was subtle at first, like a whisper against his skin. His pulse quickened, but he couldn't pinpoint why. He scanned the alley, every corner, every crack in the walls, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, he could feel it, like something was watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He spun around, instinctively reaching for his weapon. But there was no need. Li Xiu stood before him, leaning casually against a graffiti-covered wall, his arms folded. Xiu's eyes glinted with the same cold, calculating look they'd always had, but now there was something different, something that set Jiang on edge. "Jiang," Xiu said with a smirk. His voice was low, familiar, but it sent a chill down Jiang's spine. "You still look the same." "Well, mostly." Jiang narrowed his eyes. "You've run out of time, Xiu. You know what I'm here for." Xiu tilted his head. "I know. But it's not what you think." Jiang's fingers tightened on his weapon. He wasn't here for conversation. He was here to kill or capture, and Xiu knew that. But the rogue soldier didn't seem afraid. He stepped forward, his smile widening. "Do you remember what they did to us, Jiang? What they turned us into?" Xiu asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. Jiang's heart skipped a beat. The memories flooded back, those early days in the program, the tests, the surgeries, the slow but steady enhancements that had changed them into something more. He had been proud of the progress back then, proud of how the government had turned them into perfect soldiers. But now, looking at Xiu, he wasn't so sure. Xiu's grin faded, replaced by something more dangerous. "You feel it, don't you? The changes. The alterations. They're not just in my body. They're in yours too, Jiang. You've become what you were meant to hunt. Jiang's hand trembled slightly, the weapon slipping in his grip. He didn't want to admit it, but Xiao was right. He had noticed the changes in himself, those odd bursts of rage, the feelings of detachment from everything and everyone. His body had become something more than human, but at what cost? Before he could respond, Xiao moved, fast, too fast. Jiang barely had time to react as Xiao lunged at him, a blur of motion, knocking his weapon aside and sending him crashing into the concrete wall. The pain was immediate, but it was nothing compared to the shock that hit him next. Xiao's eyes were glowing now, a faint blue light pulsing from within. You've become a machine, just like the rest of us, Xiao said, his voice a low rasp. You can't escape it. Jiang's head spun. His breath came in shallow gasps. The dizziness hit him again, stronger this time, and he felt his body reacting without his command. The bio-enhancements in his body, enhancements he had always thought of as tools, were no longer under his control. But Xiao was already gone. With a blur of motion, the rogue soldier vanished into the shadows. Jiang tried to follow, but his legs felt like lead. He stumbled forward, barely keeping himself upright. His vision wavered. Something was wrong. His mind screamed at him to get up, to chase Xiao, but his body refused to listen. The enhancements, their effects were starting to overwhelm him. He could feel it now, like his body was no longer his own. Jiang finally stumbled back to his headquarters, the dizziness fading but leaving behind a lingering sense of unease. He wasn't sure how much of it was real, whether it was the physical changes or something more psychological. His superior, a stern officer named Colonel Wu, congratulated him on the success of his mission. Another rogue soldier eliminated, Jiang. Good work. But Jiang wasn't so sure. As he stood there, in the sterile, high-tech environment of the government facility, something gnawed at him. He had succeeded in his mission, but the victory felt hollow. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just Xiao who had changed. He had too. The room seemed to close in on him. He excused himself from Colonel Wu and headed to the nearest restroom, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He splashed water on his face, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. His eyes were different now, sharper. His skin looked too pale, too perfect. The enhancements had worked. He had become faster, stronger, smarter. But at what cost? Jiang closed his eyes and pressed his palms to his forehead. It was only a matter of time before he lost himself entirely. He wasn't sure what Xiao had meant by his words, but he had a sinking feeling that his old comrade was trying to warn him. Jiang's thoughts whirred as he stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror, his fingers still pressed to his forehead. He knew something wasn't right. There had always been a price to pay for enhancements. He'd heard the warnings, read the reports, seen the soldiers who'd gone too far, whose minds had snapped and turned them into something less than human. But he had always believed it was something that happened to others, not to him. Now, standing in this sterile restroom, it felt like it was happening to him. Slowly. Steadily. The enhancements, the alterations, they were no longer something that made him better. They were something that was breaking him. He felt it deep inside, in the places he couldn't reach. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he didn't have much time. The program, the same program that had given him everything, was now a trap, a prison with no way out. Jiang clenched his fists, feeling the familiar burn in his muscles. It was the same as before, the feeling of strength, of power. But this time, it felt different. It was more. It was overwhelming. His heartbeat quickened, a dull thud in his ears. Something was changing. That he pushed himself away from the sink, his reflection still staring back at him. He had to get control. He couldn't let this, whatever this was, consume him. But how could he fight something that was a part of him? A part that had become stronger, faster, more precise with every mission. A part that had been honed into the perfect weapon. With a shaky breath, Jiang turned and left the restroom. The hallway outside was empty, its walls cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights buzzing above. He needed answers. He had to know what was happening to him before it was too late. It had been days since Jiang had last seen Xiao, and yet his presence lingered, like a shadow, in every corner of Jiang's mind. Xiao had been right about one thing: the program wasn't just turning soldiers into machines, it was turning them into something else entirely. Something unpredictable. Something dangerous. Jiang's steps echoed in the hallway as he walked toward the secure section of the facility, where the program's research had originally been conducted. He'd been there before, but never in search of answers. This time, the halls felt different. This time, it felt like he was walking into a tomb, where the past was buried beneath layers of government lies. The door to the secure lab slid open with a hiss, and Jiang stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with monitors and advanced equipment, all dedicated to the bio-enhancement program that had turned him into what he was. He walked up to the central terminal, his fingers hovering over the keys, but something stopped him. He didn't know who he was looking for, or even what he was expecting to find. Maybe answers. Maybe something he could use to fix whatever was happening to him. But what if the answer was worse than the disease? He let out a slow breath and began typing. The screen blinked to life, lines of data scrolling across in rapid succession. He scanned it, trying to make sense of the code, but it was foreign to him. Numbers, sequences, graphs, everything had been encrypted, everything had been buried. But Jiang was used to finding things that weren't meant to be found. He kept typing, the commands flowing from his fingertips with the ease of someone who had been trained to break through barriers. It took a few minutes, but eventually, the encryption cracked. The screen shifted, revealing files, thousands of them. Project logs. Subject profiles. Research data. Jiang scrolled through it, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about enhancing soldiers. This was about control. There were notes detailing the psychological effects of the enhancements, the gradual breakdown of the subject's emotional stability. Some soldiers had reported hearing voices, feeling disconnected from reality, and becoming uncontrollable. Others had simply disappeared, and then Jiang found the file he was looking for. The one marked with a code he recognized. Subject Z14, Jiang, and his breath caught in his throat. He clicked on it, and the data appeared, detailing his own history, his enhancements, the surgeries, the psychological evaluations. Everything was there. But it was the last entry that sent a chill down his spine. Subject Z14 has shown signs of instability. Unusual behavioral responses. Monitoring will continue. Subject is at risk of irreversible emotional detachment. Jiang's stomach churned. The words were cold, clinical, but they struck him like a physical blow. He'd always been aware of the changes, the physical upgrades, but this was something different. It was a ticking time bomb, and he'd been living with it every day. He leaned back in the chair, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He wasn't just a weapon. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a failed experiment. The government hadn't enhanced him for strength or speed. They had enhanced him to see how far they could push a man before he cracked, and now, Xiao was right. It wasn't just the enhancements that were changing him. It was everything. The more he hunted, the more he killed, the more he lost himself. The lines between who he was and what he had become were blurring, and every mission, every fight, was pulling him further from the man he once was. Days passed, and Jiang's grip on his own mind began to slip further. The voice in his head, the one that had started as a whisper, now screamed at him in sharp bursts. He couldn't sleep without feeling his skin crawl, couldn't focus without his thoughts scattering like dust in the wind. It was like a shadow had taken root inside him, growing darker with each passing hour. The government had begun to notice. His superiors had called him in for briefings, but they seemed more concerned with his performance than the obvious signs of mental breakdown. It was clear now that they had no idea what was happening to him. Or maybe they didn't care, but Jiang cared. He couldn't just be another broken soldier, another piece of government property tossed aside when it was no longer useful. He had to finish this. He had to find a way to stop the madness before it consumed him completely, and so, Jiang went back to the city. He tracked down every rogue soldier he could find. He hunted them down one by one, not for the mission, but because he needed to feel something. He needed to prove to himself that he was still in control. That he could still do this. But with each kill, it became harder to tell where his body ended and the enhancements began. His movements were too quick, too precise. His senses were too sharp, too overwhelming. It wasn't just his body anymore, it was his mind, his emotions, his very identity that were slipping away. The final mission came without warning. The rogue soldiers had been gathering, growing in number, their ranks swelling with others who had turned their backs on the program. They were organized now, a network of resistance fighters who had seen through the lies and manipulation of the government. They were no longer just targets, they were a threat. Jiang's superiors gave him the order, eliminate them. All of them. Jiang didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. But this time, as he walked into the heart of the resistance, something in him broke. This wasn't just about killing anymore. This wasn't just about the mission. This was about survival. He fought his way through the rebel stronghold, his enhanced body moving faster than ever before. His vision flickered, and his mind felt like it was on the verge of collapse. But he pushed forward, not stopping, not slowing down. Until, in the midst of the chaos, he saw a familiar face. Xiao was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by rebels, and his eyes met Jiang's. There was no taunt this time. No mockery. Just a sad, knowing look. It's too late, Jiang, Xiao said, his voice quieter than it had ever been. You're one of us now. You've been one of us all along. Jiang's breath caught in his throat. For the first time, he realized that Xiao wasn't his enemy. Xiao had been trying to save him, trying to warn him. But it was too late. Jiang's hands trembled, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't a hunter. He was just a broken man, a tool for a program that had already consumed him. The truth was clear now. There was no going back. Jiang raised his weapon, but his hands shook. Xiao didn't move. He didn't fight back. With a final breath, Jiang lowered his weapon. He wasn't a hunter anymore. He was the hunted, and for the first time, he understood that the only way out was to let go. Jiang stood frozen in the dim light of the rebel stronghold, his weapon lowered but his heart pounding in his chest. His mind was a swirling storm of confusion and clarity, a chaotic mix of fear, rage, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. His body, honed to perfection by the enhancements, was trembling, as though it recognized something his mind had not yet fully processed. For a moment, he could only hear the distant sounds of the rebels moving around the room, their murmurs fading in the background as if they no longer mattered. Xiao was still there, standing before him with that same knowing look in his eyes. There was no malice, no hatred, just sadness. Jiang didn't know what to say. What could he possibly say? Every word felt hollow, as if the very essence of who he had once been was slipping away, drowning in a sea of upgrades and broken memories. I thought I was hunting you, Jiang finally said, his voice rough, hoarse. It barely sounded like his own. But I've been running from myself, haven't I? Xiao's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. You've been chasing ghosts, Jiang. But the only thing left to chase now is the truth. He paused, eyes locking with Jiang's. It's not too late, you know. You can still turn away from this. You can still be human. Or at least, you can try. Jiang's hand tightened around the grip of his weapon, but he didn't raise it. His thoughts were fractured, splintered between the soldier he had been and the machine he had become. It was all so much more complicated than he could have ever anticipated. The mission, the pursuit of perfection, the thrill of the hunt, it had all been a distraction. A way to avoid the truth that had been there all along. That he was losing himself. "I don't know how to stop," Jiang admitted, his voice trembling. "It's in my body now, Xiao. It's inside me. I can feel it, every time I move. Every time I breathe. I'm not who I was anymore." "You never were, not entirely," Xiao replied, his voice quiet but firm. "They sold you a lie. We were always meant to be tools, weapons for them to use. But it didn't have to be like this. We didn't have to lose ourselves." The weight of Xiao's words hit Jiang with the force of a hammer. He felt his body burn with a sudden, overwhelming anger, a fury he hadn't felt in years, an anger not of his own making. It was the enhancements. The rage, the need to fight. It was all so much a part of him now, wrapped up in the cold precision of his enhancements. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, a heavy, rhythmic beat that drowned out everything else that he had been trained for this moment. This exact moment. To fight, to kill, to win. His mind was sharp, his senses too fine-tuned. He should have been unstoppable. But instead, he felt trapped, like he was fighting against something that was not only outside of him, but inside as well. The human part of him screamed for release, but the machine, his enhancements, drowned it out, pushing him forward, demanding action. He gritted his teeth, but his hands remained steady, his weapon still at his side. The thought of killing Xiao, of finishing the mission, was almost a reflex. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the final step toward losing himself completely. "You're wrong," Jiang finally said, his voice filled with a hard edge. "I am who I am. I can't change it. I've already crossed that line." Xiao's expression didn't change. He stepped closer, his voice gentle but insistent. "It's not too late, Jiang. You're still here. The man inside is still here." Jiang shook his head. The battle inside his mind was reaching a breaking point. He couldn't hear Xiao anymore. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, his blood rushing in his ears. The weight of the weapon in his hands felt like 1,000 pounds. His fingers itched to raise it, to finish what he had started, but then something shifted, something deeper inside him. A moment of clarity, the flicker of humanity that had been buried under layers of enhancement and programming. He looked at Xiao again, and this time, it wasn't as a target. It was as a fellow human being. A reminder of what he had once been. The anger inside him began to cool, replaced by something else, fear. Fear of losing the last piece of himself. Fear of what would happen if he didn't stop. Fear that he would never be able to stop. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was silent except for the distant murmur of the rebels and the steady hum of the ventilation system. Jiang could feel the weight of Xiao's gaze on him, waiting, as though he knew what was coming. Slowly, Jiang lowered the weapon, feeling the weight of it lift from his shoulders. His mind was still a battlefield, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something other than the cold, detached clarity of his enhancements. He wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the answer. "I don't know how to fix this," Jiang said quietly, his voice hoarse. "But I'm not going to kill you." Xiao's lips curved into a slight, sad smile. "That's the first step, Jiang." But even as he said it, a new sound echoed through the room, an alarm, low and insistent. It was a warning. They were not alone. The door to the stronghold slammed open with the force of a battering ram, and in poured a squad of government soldiers, their weapons raised, ready to put an end to whatever rebellion Jiang and Xiao had started. The rebels scrambled, shouting orders, but Jiang's mind was already in motion. He reached for Xiao's arm, pulling him back as the soldiers charged in. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to finish what they had started, and Jiang knew the program wasn't about to let him go so easily. The government had invested too much in him, in all of them, and they would not allow them to escape. "We can't fight them, Jiang," Xiao said urgently, his eyes scanning the room. "There are too many of them." Jiang knew it was true. He could hear the soldiers' boots pounding on the concrete, getting closer. But as he looked at Xiao, the strange calm that had overtaken him earlier settled deeper. He had spent so long running, so long hunting. But now, for the first time, he realized that the real battle wasn't against the soldiers or the government. The real battle was for his soul. "We don't have to fight them," Jiang said, his voice steady, but the tension in the room was palpable. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew one thing: he was done running. Done being their weapon. "We run." Xiao nodded, and without another word, they turned, weaving through the rebels as the soldiers stormed in. The alarms continued to blare, and the chaos erupted around them. For the first time in years, Jiang felt the rush of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He could still feel his enhancements, still feel the danger they posed. But he wasn't going to let them define him anymore. They broke through the back exit, the cool night air rushing over them as they fled into the streets of the city. Behind them, the sounds of battle faded, but Jiang didn't look back. He wasn't just running from the government. He was running from the man he had become, and, for the first time in a long time, he was running toward something more than just survival. He didn't know where they would go or what would happen next. But one thing was clear: he wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to find out who he really was.